we have bitten the tree, the apple or the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it won't go away. Just like those who can't stand nuclear power and nuclear energy. Unfortunately, the nuclear genie will not go away because we know it exists. And even if it was banned today, one of us, for example, in this very room might go out and make our own little bomb. Because we know we can do it. We know how it's done. Okay, we'll go back to money for a minute. Money, it may or may not be the root of anything, but money is certainly in the middle, the branches of everything. It's the great medium of exchange. It comes about, according to von Mises, there's a thing called regression. And this is yet again the use of words of progress and regress here, and yet another way. According to von Mises, let's say these little things are commodities, and they should all be different looking things. Anyway, so what happens is these things are being traded among various human actors. Well, we're trying to figure out some way of keeping track of this or making change or whatever is required. So there seems to be more of these than anything else around. And these seem to be in a fairly good demand. So I'm going to start counting out whenever I want to trade a hexagon or a triangle or a circle, I'm going to do it in the form of a rectangle. Squares are pretty rare here. I don't think I'll use them. The rectangles also don't wear out much. There's a whole series of things that you want. You want a certain amount of recognition. You want, that's mixed in with something called fungibility, which means that I'll recognize that I'll know it's of some value and I'll accept it a lot. You also want something that's durable, because you don't want your wealth to evaporate, you don't want it to turn rancid, you don't want it to rot, you don't want it to,
turn your finger green.
Small price to pay, perhaps. But anyway, that's true. If you had everything but the finger turning green, you'd probably go for the non-green finger version. And again, it would sort out. So what happens is in this constant commodity trade, some commodity becomes preferred. Now, there may be more than one at the beginning. Some commodity becomes a preferred. Again, it's preferred because anything can be a medium of exchange, but some commodity becomes a preferred medium of exchange. All right, well, here we've got one or more of them. Again, something that's readily recognizable, well, there are a lot of things. Salt might work, diamonds might work, crystalline type stuff is pretty durable. Metals, of course. And some hard red winter wheat, which the one branch of libertarians used to like a lot. But the problem with some of these, butter, in fact, was used as trade goods. Playing cards at one time. All of these were mediums of exchange. The problem is, in the case of playing cards, it's easy to print up a lot of cards and cut them up and claim that, oh, this is money now. This was given out by the intendant of Quebec, which is the guy who originally used them. And how do you know the difference? So, I don't know, if I could just whip up more rectangles very easily, then they don't seem to have much value. So we're going to use those. Or we're going to, actually it's not that kind of choice. What happens in the free market is I look at those and I look at something else being used, and I go for the one, I make my choices from the existing spectrum, and a lot of people make it. A few people make wrong choices, a few people make different choices. But as long as an overwhelming choice exists, again, we get into the preferred part. So, give me butter for exchange, but I look at salt and I say salt's going to last longer. I think I prefer that. Give me wheat. Well, the wheat rots. I think I'll stick with salt. What about diamond? Well, that's pretty good, except I can break up the salt, and breaking diamonds is a bit dicey. Salt's much easier, so I'll stick with salt. But what about this stuff I found? It's a metal. Ah, well, what is it? Iron. Iron rusts. Yeah, it's true. But salt washes away. Maybe a good rain and suddenly my acids are down the drain. Dissolved. Oh, that's true. So sit there and argue about iron and salt, and we might have an iron-salt exchange, and we go on that way for a while, and then somebody comes up with, well, look at this copper stuff. It turns kind of green, including my finger, but it doesn't rust away. It just sort of sits there after it turns green, and we still got it. We might be able to get rid of the green. Yeah, that's not too bad. So we drop our iron and salt, or maybe some of us stick with some of it, and so we'll switch over. And finally somebody comes up with this silvery stuff, and it never rusts. So we can't figure it. And it takes a real effort of this alchemy, chemistry wasn't invented at the time, to turn it black. So that's pretty good stuff. And then somebody suggests gold. well, after we see that around and people make jewelry of it and what have you, we notice that lasts so long. Not only that, it's incredibly useful. It turns out that gold is ductile and you can draw it into very long, thin wires, and later on, when we get around to discovering electricity, we can run current through it. So, it turns out commodity, of course, is something that has a use. It turns out that whatever becomes money is going to start out as a highly useful commodity. It's going to have a lot of durability and fungibility. It'll be a preferred medium of exchange, and at that point it crosses over to, what is the final crossover? Why do we go from commodity to money? What is this sort of borderline area that we got to cross over? How do we know when something stepped over the line? Well, we no longer worry about its commodity value. That's why. It started out commodity. It started out as a damn useful commodity. It had to be around. A lot of people had to know it was there. They had to have a feel for it. They had to know, if you mentioned it, they said, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. I can accept that in trade. Otherwise, it would never become on the road to money. But when it gets to the end of the road, that commodity value is gone. It doesn't care anymore. Nobody cares it's a useful value. It has reached the point at which you only want it as something for the in-between, for the entrepreneur, the in-between action. It only sort of vibrates between exchanges. It never needs to land. And that, unfortunately, is where our old enemies of state got into the picture. Now, the state is parasitical. It doesn't think. It's extremely stupid, as we'll see in our counter-economics discussion. It's a dinosaur-like creature. But the state has always had its friends who, the Robert Stadlers, for those of you like the Atlas Shrugged view of the world, the collaborators, the people who, the fast buck artists who themselves aren't yet part of the state and show the state how it can plunder even more if it adopts them, if it adds them to the system. So, some of them saw money. And the ones who actually saw this were the people who were involved in this progression the most, and these were the people in gold warehouses. The gold warehouses store the precious metals. Again, these had boiled out, distilled out of the marketplace as a choice. So what happened was, these warehouses, which kept the value, would say, okay, we'll provide you with a service. The service is that we store it for you. We write out a certificate. You walk around with the certificate, this piece of parchment or rolled up paper or whatever, and present this, and they'll come in and get the gold. So after people got used to this for a while and trusted the system, then came the biting of the apple and the committing of sin or whatever you want to do. Some of these warehouse guys said, well, I don't have to have all this gold here all the time. People don't come that often. What if I wrote out a couple of extra certificates to cover a couple of bills that I just didn't have enough to cover? Now, people do that all the time. They sometimes run their credit cards up or whatever, or kite their checks in nowadays world. So, this is not in itself one of the great crimes of the world, but when they did this, sometimes they get away with it for quite a while, actually, sometimes even over a generation or two. But they could also get caught. And how they would get caught is, the only way, is if somebody decided to call in all the warehouse receipts at once. And once in a while, no matter how careful they were, it would happen. And at that point, there would be what was going to be called a few hundred years later, a run on the bank, and these guys could not pay up. They didn't have enough gold, because they'd given more certificates than they had gold to cover, and they would be shut down, and that would shake everybody's confidence in the system for a while. Trust would die down, and you get back to those risk factors we were talking about, and so forth and so on. Okay, so later, at this step, of course, we don't directly have the state yet. We've got venal evil, as they would say in church terms, but not yet cardinal evil. Somewhere along the line, the money warehouse people decided they were going to do the state a favor. In fact, we can pinpoint in history pretty well to about starting around the 1600s. And what they decided they were going to do is the government, the king, the statist, the nation states were just beginning, and in fact one of the things that created nation states was the fact that they could combine their, how should I put it, their value, their mortgage value of the country. If you could get one king who sort of commanded all the nobles, and that could be held as a big asset, then they could get more money from these money warehouse people to go and fight wars. They could get financial backing for their wars. So you have these early banks, gold banks, hard money banks, except they became fractional reserve, which you brought up earlier, and they started lending to the kings, and they would run off and fight wars with them as long as they could get money. And if they won their wars and paid off the banks, great, they were good investments. And if they didn't win their wars and didn't pay off, well, they were bad investments. The banks may go under, and the country might go under and become conquered too. So this is where we get the first interference between the money system and the kings. This spreads over a long history of time. What I'm doing is kind of compressing a lot of things, because you go back as early as Lydia, when the first, what we think of as modern money, with the king's head being stamped on coins, and that predates the Roman Empire. Most of what I'm talking about here, however, did occur in the late Middle Ages to early Renaissance period, and then the beginning of the nation-states. You find another early version of this during the banking era of the Medici of Italy, the Renaissance period, where they were heavy into trade. You find it again in the rise of the Hanseatic League in the North European water area. And finally, not finally, but another step along the way, the British World Bank, which goes back only to the 1700s. And finally, it evolved into the United States after the Revolution. The first thing they did when they decided that they were going to subvert the Revolution and set up a state with a constitution is set up a Bank of the United States. And that became a major issue until, in a sort of reform, classical liberal action, Andrew Jackson abolished the National Bank, and the U.S. was free for it for a while until the Civil War came along, and a new one was set up in effect and issued things called greenbacks. And we can go through the whole history into modern times. How they did that, greenbacks and all the rest of it, basically is no big step from here, because all they did was take these warehouse receipts and forget that there was a warehouse. And if that wasn't good enough for you, they would tell you, forget about the warehouse. You are not allowed to think about the warehouse. We will put a gun to your head if you keep asking about the warehouse. And thus was the form of money without gold, without backing, which is divorced from this, called fiat. What does fiat mean? It's an edict of the state. I tell you by fiat. That means I've ordered you to do something. And that's where fiat money comes from. It is money by order of the state, by order of the king, by order of the ruler, sovereign, whatever. And, however, the interesting thing is, again, the state perverts, it does not create. It had to go through all these steps, including this perverted step here, before it could get there. The government can come around and say, lo and behold, there is money. And everybody say, huh? Say what? What's this? Sorry, we don't know what you're talking about. Only if these steps have gone through, and then the fraudulent, putting a new face on the warehouse receipts happens, can in fact the state do it. It has to climb all this way technologically up the capital pyramid before this can occur. Yeah.
So in other words, it has to build credibility before it can defraud people.
Right. It's just like you have to have a credit rating. You have to have credit before you can get bad credit. If you have good credit and you get the money and you go off and not pay your debt, then you get bad credit. But you can't start out with bad credit. And
so conceivably, this wouldn't be happening in an agorist society.
Well, what could happen in a market society? In a market society or Agorist society or Agoric society, which is before Agorism, what would happen is everything up to this last step here. That could happen. That did happen, even all over states around the time. What could happen is that you could get some crooked warehouse people, some crooked gold warehouse people. They could hand out extra receipts, paper money of the sort. And as soon as people noticed that they didn't have any more, we get the run of the bank. And the crooked ones get weeded out. Von Mises in Human Action in his banking books points out that's exactly what happened. When banks go fractional reserve, the ones with the highest reserves can always force their lower reserve competitors out of the market by calling in the receipts. Now, that's a side question I didn't get into, but why is it that they have the power or the ability to do that? Because in fact what happens is this money, warehouse 1, warehouse 2, and so forth, is that ultimately all this is circulating through these money warehouses or banks as they will eventually be called. And if I borrow money from warehouse one, and I give it to you. You're going to take yours because you don't want to carry it around. You might not even again see the gold. If you know about warehouse one, you think, okay, they're all right. You go to your warehouse, which is warehouse two, and you give them the receipt and say, here, transfer to my account here, warehouse two, take from warehouse one, and move it there at your convenience. I don't want to have to carry money around the street. There are bandits around. So the transfer is just, in fact, in this case, just go between warehouses, and that's why you can have this run to the bank. What's the opposite possibility? This is the one that the paranoid non-free marketeers worry about. Collusion, right. Well, what's the problem with collusion here? The same problem is, before we answer that one, let's set up an analogy. Suppose we have a business in a particular industry. Okay, I don't care what the industry is. Let's say it's an easy one to think.
Oil. Oil?
Oil, all right. All right, so oil, which is a somewhat more modern concept than what we're on at the moment, but let's say oil. And let's say we have oil 1, oil 2, and oil, all the way down to oil N, where we'll pick some number, where N is greater than 2. Actually, it could be done with 2, I suppose. But there are a lot of them. They're in here, a whole set of oil companies. Companies or people, individuals, partnerships, any way you want to organize it voluntarily. And each of these own a certain amount of oil resources, and they occasionally bring them to market, or they store them according to whether or not they want to figure they're going to get the right price, because there's a certain, if you think that the future price of oil, again, we get the future prices and present prices and so forth, and we judge it all by past prices, because that's the only ones we really know, the only ones that have ever really occurred. We sit here and decide whether or not we're going to sell the oil, keep the oil, or whatever. Now, let's say oil 1 through N all get together at a meeting someday. We have an oil convention, we have great parties and private refreshments, and then we sit around and talk. And we say, hey, why don't we all get together and collude? Let's all raise the price together. Well, if they do it, the first thing that happens, remember what price means. If you raise the price level, what happens is fewer people, their subjective value tables are being satisfied, so fewer people are going to buy oil. Okay, the price level has been forced up by collusion. They've all sat down and agreed that they're going to raise the price. So the first thing that happens is fewer people buy it. So each gallon or each unit of oil is now more expensive because it was declared to be that way, but no, there's not as many people buying it. Well, that's not too bad. That's not too bad because they're still sitting on a lot of oil. Maybe they can just keep collecting extra money over a long period of time. Not so bad so far. But wait, what happens if oil N+1 suddenly forms and runs in and pulls a resource that was previously marginal into the system? And suddenly competition will drive price level back down again. And oil 1 through N have not only not gained stuff, but are now in fact losing a certain amount of whatever the total market was before to oil N+1. They're not coming out ahead on this at all until the price level falls down and they're back where they started. Well, that wasn't too good. So they invite oil N+1 to join, but of course they know that oil N+2 is waiting in the wings if they don't do something about that. So they got a problem here. Well, let's say that they're going to take a chance. At some point, it looks like you can't find any oil. Maybe there's a big gap between getting the next level resource and there. See, there are a lot of factors that have to be covered when you're dealing with any kind of project. I said you can do this with any industry, but as soon as you pick one, you've got to go through all the factors. Let's say, for sake of argument, that there's really hard to find one here now, and they're just going to market the ones that they've got. Centrist goes back to Paris. Well, the problem with that is these people were not equal. Let's say they were equal. Let's say they were absolutely equal. Each one of these oil companies were exactly the same. They were exactly as efficient as each other. They could produce everything exactly the same way. Then what? That wouldn't make any difference. It turns out that they would divide whatever the price they attempted to fix would simply work out to an even division once again. It's very rare that that ever happens. There's almost always going to be a very slight epsilon and a very slight amount of difference somewhere. If there is a difference in their efficiency, productivity, and so forth, then that means that one of them has a little lower cost than the other one. If they have a little lower cost, and there's a fixed same price, that company will be making a little more profit. Not only that, they have a tremendous incentive, because they can still make the same profit as these other people at a lower price, but they're not doing it at the moment. What happens then? This is the first case that I've ran into that Murray Rothbard brings up, because he deals with this, the question of cartels is what it's called, in which counter-economics raises its head, because in fact what they do is something called cheating. The most efficient, most productive member of any cartel has a tremendous incentive to deal under the table, as they say, and offer the best customers a little extra if they buy it all from oil one, from him or her, and not from oil two or oil down the efficiency line. We'll assume they're ordered according to efficiency. So oil one, somewhere along the line, will cheat. Even if oil one is an absolute paragon of virtue, God knows what, a real monk, diehard who happened to just fall in the oil industry because he couldn't get into the seminary. Oil two is now thinking, oh well, at least oil one's never going to do that. But oil 3 to N is still pretty bad. I don't know what oil one's up to. I guess maybe that goody is living up to it. But heck, I'm going to offer you a really good deal if you buy my oil at the slightly lower price. Just buy a lot of it from me and ignore the others. So there goes the old cartel agreement again. Well, this goes on. And of course, as the others point out that the cheating has occurred, they probably get mad and call each other names, and the thing breaks down. Even when governments with the power of armies are behind each of these, if it isn't one government with one army, but a bunch of governments with a bunch of armies, and they can't enforce it on each other, even if each one of these is connected with a state, the cartel will fall. Proof? Well, Victor probably brought this up because there is, in fact, an obvious case existing right now, the so-called Organization of Petroleum
Exporting
countries. Right, I can't remember what the E was. OPEC. And as you know, the cartel is totally shattered to smithereens. And the controlling factor was the most efficient, productive one, that is Saudi Arabia, as everyone knew. And they were in the position of oil one. In fact, a lot of the cases, some of the less efficient ones, like Nigeria, were busily cheating because they needed money. There were other factors in their efficiency because some of them were so deeply in debt to the International Monetary Fund they wouldn't care what prices they got. They just needed to sell.
But OPEC, Saudi Arabia wasn't doing the cheating, though.
Wasn't what?
Saudi Arabia wasn't the one doing the cheating, right?
No, I was pointing out that, in fact, in the OPEC case, there were other, again, the ceteris paribus thing. In the real world, there's all these other factors. In the case of countries like Nigeria and Mexico, they have a tremendous IMF debts that they have to cover no matter what. The only thing they've got to cover with is oil. They don't have anything else worthwhile. Libya has to pay for their international terrorist networks, right? And so they have to pump some extra oil even if they want to keep Saudi Arabia is an interesting case, and it goes very complicatedly in the oil OPEC case because Saudi Arabia, in fact, is one of the most efficient producers of oil, and technically it would be the natural one to cheat. The reason it doesn't has to do with, when we get back into the banking conspiracy or whatever you want to call it that I alluded to earlier, there are other factors in play, and they're very, very important and very powerful. Oil does not rule the world. There's something even deeper behind that, and therefore they attempted to control. In fact, as it turns out, the market rules the world and quickly broke up the monopoly when the financiers tried to control it. This has in fact happened throughout history. A lot of the school books try to teach you about trusts and what they were formed in the 1800s and so forth, the attempt at cartelization, how evil this was, and why we needed government regulation. But in reality, every time it was tried, it fell apart of its own weight. The governments never got around to it. What the great revisionist historians like Edward Konkin ended up proving was that you needed to set up, or what these people wanted was to set up a government to enforce the cartels and call it regulation and call it, for their own good. He called it the triumph of conservatism. And you might want to check out the book of that name. Anyway, so that's what all this happens. Now, what does this apply to back with money? Because that's where we've got now for warehouse 1 and warehouse 2. It's the same principle. I just happen to switch to a different commodity and give you, so you wouldn't have the particular case fall. In the case of the warehouses, if they attempt to collaborate, if they attempt to form a cartel without the intervention of a unified central state, it'll disintegrate, it will fall, it will not hold. Again, the more efficient bank, or the one with the highest reserves, the one who seems to be making a lot of money without lending quite as much, dipping below the reserve rates, will have an advantage to not only, in a sense, steal the customers from the others in the banking cartel, but in fact to break their competitors by causing bank runs. So unless they can find some other way of enforcing it, they've got a problem. And this is the other way of enforcing it, the only way ultimately of enforcing it. And this is certainly not economically neutral if the state intervenes on their behalf.
Well, I think the original question was about whether there would be inflation in agorist society.
Okay, what would happen so this attempt, what I'm saying is up to this point of attempting to collude, attempting to form a banking or monetary cartel, this could happen on a market society. We could get up to that point, and then it would fall. It would shatter of its own weight. If they cannot cartelize, then they cannot monopolize the money. If they cannot monopolize the money, they've got a problem with inflation. How can you inflate? Well, first of all, what is inflation? Inflation is, and here we deal with it purely in Austrian terms, inflation is the increase of the money supply. And nothing else. Does that mean the prices will rise? Maybe. Not necessarily. Maybe. A price increase is not necessarily inflation. A price decrease is not necessarily deflation. They might happen. What you don't know is what would happen if all other things were equal, ceteris paribus. Because there are all sorts of reasons why prices go up and down. Sometimes they may even go up, large numbers of them may even go up in concert because of resource changes in resources, changes in people's subjective values. Suddenly the entire buggy whip market, as well as buggies themselves, horses, harnesses, and everything else go under. Meanwhile, the new car industry is thriving. Huge amounts of possibly secretarial, processing work is suddenly going on the market, going downhill. There are fewer and fewer people in it. The wage rates are falling. Meanwhile, the computer industry and word processing might be thriving and going up. So all sorts of things are going on. Some of these might be localized in a world market where trade is going on between different countries. In one country, you might see a lot of the people who are using old methods being driven down by technology and progressive economy in another area, which is replacing it. So that one area they seem to be very productive and prospering and so forth. In the other area, the old backward area that's going downhill, they're losing money, losing value, losing productivity, and so forth. So it looks like there's depression. And none of that could have anything to do with the money supply. That could just be the way things are going. Resources are shifting to where they're best utilized. So we don't know for sure, but this has always a purpose. When you increase the money supply, what it does do is rip off somebody. It takes away everybody who was participating in the money system thought they had so much value, either in their warehouse or in their hands or whatever, the receipts they were carrying. And in fact, if you increase the total, you cut how much they have. You diluted their share of it, and therefore you visibly managed to cut away some of their value. Yeah.
Just fixing the money supply.
What?
In your definition of money, you left out one of the ingredients.
Sure.
Value.
The what?
Silver value.
Yeah, right. You can. I mentioned it, but I mentioned it, but I didn't write it down. You're right. It's a storage value. You know. I was talking about the fact that if it rots away, for example, it wouldn't be very good store value. Sure.
What about these people that argue if we go to a gold standard, which I know this isn't a gold standard, but assuming you have an agorist society where money is tied to commodities and there's no fractional reserve unless it's specified in the contract, then doesn't that limit the expansion of credit and thereby the progressiveness of your society?
No, expansion of credit has nothing to do with the progression of society. In fact, one could make a counterexample. The more inflation you have, the less progression you'll have in the economy. It'll actually force a regression. Because what inflation does, since inflation increases the money supply, and you can't do it voluntarily, as we pointed out here, in order to increase an entire money supply, you have to unify it. The only way you can unify it is to have every goddamn bank as part of it. If any of them aren't, then they're not part of the money supply, they're not being controlled. There's no way to inflate it. Anytime you intend to inflate, and the way of inflating of independent banks that are operating in government is by the fractional reserve system, they're going to be called upon, they're going to be driven out of business. So there's a natural market check on it. Only if you can unify them can you get this, and the only way you can unify them is through the state. So you unify it by the state, you start pumping in more money in the system, which is the same as creating more warehouse receipts with less gold. That is taking money from everyone, which is the same as taxation. The taxation is, again, hits the capital pyramid, although interestingly enough, it doesn't, well, it depends. It varies on which part of the capital pyramid it hits. But as long as it eats away at the capital pyramid, it tends to be regressive. It knocks down the economy.
And the fact that there's a limited amount of gold in the world isn't going to affect the amount.
No, because of ultimately being commodity-based, it just changes the price of the gold. The price, money itself is a price. Rothbard describes it as, take all the commodities. Imagine an infinite list of all the things you can buy and sell. Okay, and each of these has a price, right? Price 1, price 2, price 3, and some universal medium of exchange, something that we're now accepting, gold, for example. And what you do is you take the reciprocals of all these, and that average or whatever, that summation becomes the price of money. What he does first is add them all together and form what he calls a price level or price, something, I forgot there's a V in it, and then he takes the reciprocal of that, and that's the value of money, the price of money. So that's what happens with money. If gold is if for some reason gold was vanishing, I guess a certain amount of it does evaporate, one atom every so often or whatever. If there's a slow leak of gold in the world, then all that would happen is this price of money would slowly go up, and therefore the price of every individual commodity would go slightly down relative to money. Okay, so everything would be worth everything would be a little cheaper relative to gold. Gold would be worth more. Yeah.
Wouldn't prices have to be constantly going down? If you look at the price of
In what economy? Are you talking about
free economy?
Are you assuming? No. What I mean is, are you assuming fixed gold, or are you?
No, it doesn't matter. Look at pocket calculators, for example. The ratio of the price of them is the ratio of one thing to another.
Yeah.
So when you talk about what's the price of a dollar in terms of how many pocket calculators it costs to get it.
But suppose pocket calculators are now falling out of the market because there was no longer enough of a capital pyramid to sustain the production.
Okay, but yeah, that's the state situation. But look at just the situation of improving technology. Technology, the production system will improve. There's always incentive.
Well, okay, I could make a semi-plausible case, a David Friedman-like case, that that one of you came in here and started a new cult, right? And here we're the entire economy, all right? We're the entire known economy of this continent or something, and nobody else is easily achievable. And you came in here, the Art Smith method of positive thinking, of renouncing material goods and so forth. And you convinced us all that we should only work an hour a day, and we should spend all the rest of our time in heavy meditation and contemplation of these wonderful truths that you've given us. And you win a lot of us over, and there's an overwhelming move in this general direction. And the amount of work we put in, and the amount of investment we put in, the amount of capital we put in declines drastically, and we could have a regressive economy. That would be one way of generating it without a state interference. You just simply persuade everybody voluntarily to give up a lot of material values. That could happen. There has been brief blips in history where that seems to happen, at least in certain areas at certain times. There's certainly indication that India went through that, and some of the Middle and some of the Far East.
I think the question he may be asking is that as the capital pyramid increases, and let's assume that there's only a fixed amount of gold, we've dug it all out of the world, and yet we're creating more stuff, we're creating more other goods. Won't the price, since there's only a fixed amount of gold, won't the prices of everything else in relation to gold tend to drop as we...
The flip side of why inflation runs prices up.
Well,
Right.
but the key thing is progressive economy.
Right.
In a progressive economy, assuming a fixed money supply, in a progressive economy, prices would all fall.
Yeah, that was my question. Wouldn't it be absolutely inevitable?
But it's only
constantly.
if it's a progressive economy.
But real wealth would increase.
In a progressive economy, real wealth increases while price goes down. Yes.
So dropping prices and dropping wages would not be a threat.
Real wealth goes down or goes up in a sense, but you got to be careful when you use that word because the word wealth is already beginning to drag in subjective values. If everything's cheaper, do you value it as much? You know, if it's easy to find it.
Only asymptotically.
The extrapolation to infinity. Yeah, there is the concept which I've been able to avoid so far, and I can probably avoid for the rest of it if you want, is the Mises and the Wall Street economic concept called evenly rotating economy. And even the name sounds complicated. It's very easy to picture if you're into physics and science, but it's those of you who don't like that sort of way of thinking of things probably would have problems with it. What it does kind of refer to is imagining things continuing as if you could just simply assume everything was going to continue along as they were going now. You could kind of picture this thing where all these dynamic exchanges were going on in a regular sort of rotating or vibrating pattern. That's why they call it evenly rotating economy. They cannot exist because of entrepreneurship, because of constant change of new ideas, information exchange, and so forth. But it's a model that economists unfortunately have to use.
There are no free lunches, but there are cheap ones aplenty if you know where to look.
Unstoppable indeed. Yes, it is true, but what I wanted to do, what you were saying is both true, but it also has to be properly understood and qualified. That is to say, in a progressive economy, prices will fall. In a progressive economy with a fixed money supply. Now, what about the case where you have a progressive economy, even with a stake, because you're going to need it for the next premise I'm going to throw in. What happens if you have a progressive economy, and here's our money supply. Now, if we're, and we need a state at this point, if we're going to inflate it, okay, there's our pump. We're inflating the money, right? Now, suppose, however, remembering the prices of all of this here, we're in a progressive economy. Now, if money was stable, if it was totally fixed, and we had a progressive economy, then the price level would fall. We pump up the money, let's assume now, we don't even have to assume a progressive economy, just assume a stagnant economy for that matter, and we pump up the money, prices will rise. In general, on average, everything else being equal, because it's not necessarily true. You can't go by price rise as an indication of inflation. You gotta go and see what the government's doing, if they're screwing around with the money supply or not. It's the only way you can really tell. Right now, for example, we have a fairly good level of inflation going on, but the price increase is very low. The government's, in other words, the government's getting away with their shell game right now, where most people aren't really noticing it. But on the whole, everything else being equal, this should be true. Well, the Chicago School crosses truth. I guess occasionally they have to notice some truth. And decided, well, you know, price level is the important thing. Let's not worry about such things as states and money supplies and progressive economies. Let's worry about a price level. Let us decide that price level is the most important thing in the world, and we're going to pump money in just at the right rate in this economy of ours, which is for some mysterious reason is progressive. We have no idea why this is. Well, we might have some idea, but we put it on the other section of the book. And so we're going to pump in money just enough to keep this the price level from dropping in a progressive economy. We're going to put in a little inflation, but nobody will notice it because it'll keep the price level constant. This was a great contribution of the Fisher School, which Milton Friedman was the hero. Well, and once people like Murray pointed out to me, I mean, I didn't even know anybody worshipped this particular god, but once I looked at it, I mean, it seemed totally ridiculous. Why? What's the great about having a constant price level? Remember, that says nothing about any of the individual prices. They're going to be fluctuating up and down like mad, like they always do, according to supply and demand, whatever the cost of fresh eggs are today. Well, nonetheless, they said that was important. Well, let's suppose, however, we decide that they're not telling us everything. Suppose we decide that all these people in this particular school, or a lot of them, maybe there's a couple of sincere ones, but let's assume they're all on government salary. Suddenly it begins to make a different sort of sense. Because if the price level is maintained, there isn't too much screwing around here, it seems like that would be fairly economically neutral, at least as far as when you're looking at prices to make your economic investment decisions, you're not going to notice too many weirdness that's going on. So you're going to probably make reasonable and rational decisions, and the economy won't be screwed around too much. Meanwhile, of course, because the government's pumping the money supply, pump goes this way, but in fact value, the rip-off, the plunder goes that way. So in fact the state's now making its income and its living. And thus the Fisher School, the Friedmanite School, claim to be limited government free marketeers who have found an economically neutral way of living off taxation. There would be no taxes, there would just be the slow 3 to 5% drain off of all this price level drop that would exist in a progressive economy. They found the size of a parasite which can bleed off just enough that you won't notice it and want to pull off the little tick from it. Well, of course, the problem with that is the state ultimately always goes back to its barbarous nature. It wants to plunge an extra fang in and suck a little more out, and it just isn't going to go along with that. In fact, what's happened in the real world is every time that the Friedmanite school proposes this kind of thing is they add it on to all the other things you're doing as just one more trip, and of course inflation gets out of hand. Well, anyway, that was supposedly the ideal system for a lot of people. But the Chicago School, and here we go back to von Mises and his theory of money and credit. After going through time preference, after showing us the interest and so forth, he now showed that this inflation, and this, by the way, is a classical definition. I'm using an Austrian definition here, but it did not arise with Austrian. It's pre-Austrian. What happened is most of the non-Austrian schools dropped it because they all ended up taking salaries from these guys or from their institutions and foundations and universities. So they started changing the name to smuggle in a little contradiction or two. But in fact, there's yet another problem with inflation, and this is why the Austrian school is today taken seriously. They pointed out one more thing, and they explained something that nobody else could explain. In the 1900s, actually it goes back to at least the 1830s, I believe. Rothbard wrote a paper on the first one that was studied called The Panic of 1819. But what happened is something called a business cycle. This seemed really arcane, something mystical, something sorcerous. You know, why would it seem that all of the prices, well, not all, but huge amounts of prices would go up and huge amounts would go down. At one point, all sorts of people were being hired, and the economy was incredibly progressive and robust and bustling. And then, a couple of years later, with down into a depression. You know, we had a manic depressive economy. You know, up against heights. You know, ate some sugar and shut up, and then it would hit its lows. We'd get depressed, and all sorts of people would be laid off, and business liquidations, and goods would be sold, you know, cheaply just to get rid of them and pay off debts. And this happened a lot. Well, there's yet another unexplained economic phenomenon so seen. And once again, you got all the cranks came running out of the woodwork. And the social creditors and the Henry Georgists and the Marxists and all the others had their own explanations from their own pet theory of why there was such a thing. It was a business cycle, and it did exist. No question about it. You could feel it. There was indeed concerted, collective buying, investing, upshots, upsurges in the economy versus a collective, again, down, selling, liquidating, firing people, and so forth. It turns out that after studying this, before the Great Depression, before even World War I, which was followed by one hell of a really good business downturn, cycle downturn, Ludwig von Mises in 1910 gave a solution. It was just arcane enough that it wasn't immediately apparent to everybody, but it is also straightforward enough that when it's explained, it becomes pretty obvious. And thus, in my opinion, a good indicator of its truth. That is, we have a state, we have a controlled money supply. If we don't have that, we're going to have a business cycle. That alone is, of course, giving us some interesting information here. Well, what it does is the following. When the state inflates the money system, when it increases the money, the question is, remember that little backflow I was going to mention there for a minute? Where does it go? Well, it goes to the state. What does that mean? Who's the state? It means it goes to whoever this institution decides should get it. It might be welfare recipients, it might be big business, unlucky, it might be defense contractors. You can name your own pet peeves or whatever point of history these people went to. So, the flow up here was continuing. It goes back into the economy. Because these people, when they're not acting with the state, now go out and spend it like anybody else. They have the money first. So, recipients of stolen wealth, one through, we'll call them some medium M, R1 through RM, these are all the people lined up at the trough, their snouts and visibly feeding, are getting the first bloom of wealth, and they see around them the price level that exists, and they go out and spend it. Okay, fine. They're now bidding up, they're getting the stuff that somebody else would have normally bought at that price. Well, of course, the moment that money comes in and you know, you were there, you were going to buy it at that price, and suddenly one of these R recipients had come in and bought it from you before you could get it, and they offered a little bit more if necessary. Well, darn it, you're going to have to bid more because you still got to get that whatever it was to feed your industry, to keep your thing going. So what's going to happen is a slow increase in the price. As these people keep getting money and keep going in, either I'll bid it up to get the stuff that I need, or they'll bid it up to beat me to it with their ill-gotten gain. Now, the first thing, though, is that I also see some of the, probably not the same ones, some other recipients of whatever field I'm in, I'm assuming I'm one of the moral people, are out there wanting to sell something. I mean, buy something. And I've got stuff to sell. So I look at it and I say, gee, yesterday I could only sell 100 widgets. Today there's people at that price who are buying 150 widgets. I better increase my widget production. I'm going to hire some more people, buy some more capital in the factors of production of the widgets industry, and lo and behold, I open up a second widget plant. Or maybe even a third. Maybe I already got to it. I open a third widget plant up. So I'm now producing 150 widgets to satisfy the market. But the price level is climbing. And as the price level climbs because the money pours in, the prices of widgets are going up. Well, the problem, I mean, even though I may be producing more, the prices are going up, and therefore, at some point where it hits the rate of the money coming in here, this price level will somewhere eventually equalize out, or sometimes even overshoots for a brief point in time. The demand, the actual demand drops. That is to say, there's people in there bidding it, but they're still now in the money, even though they're now offering 150% of what they were offering before, it doesn't buy as much for me anymore. I've got to ask for even more money. So I'm now asking for the equivalent of, say, 200 for 150's worth, and of course, at that point, I'm not clearing the market. These people aren't buying as much anymore. To them, it's too expensive, even with this extra money coming in. And at that point, I suddenly find I'm not selling the extra widgets anymore. The price levels are catching up all over the place. I need to get more money to pay the same bills I had, but I can't do it. And now it looks like this whole thing is ephemeral. The 150 I'm getting for the 100 widgets is in fact only enough to buy 100 widgets, and I'm producing 50 widgets I didn't need to. So plant number 3's got to go down. The workers are going to be fired. If I didn't catch on this fast enough, I might have lost so much money I've got to close down plant number 2 and maybe contract out of 1 plant of widgets. So now we have even fewer widgets going into the market for a while until we can clear all of that investment. And that's the other end of the cycle. So what I described in one industry added up to all industries. Some of them will feel it, some of them won't. But the net effect is that a lot of them more will feel it than won't. You have the first injection of money from the inflation, the injection of false money into the system. That's known as, with expanded production to compensate for the new bidded products. More workers being hired, you have a boom. You liquidate that. The malinvestment must be flushed out of the economy. Depression. Boom bust. Or another version of that is, of course, bust. Or those are like 4-letter words beginning with B. So you have a boom bust cycle. And that's in fact where the business cycle comes from. This was not known, not understood until 1910 when Ludwig von Mises wrote his famous paper. Okay, nowadays it's become more and more accepted. Even the Chicago School talks about money as being important to all this. In fact, they make nothing but money and they disregard the rest of Austrian theory, and therefore they're called monetarists. What happens, what's really interesting is what happens if this continues. Because what happens, first of all, is these price level things is eventually people catch on. The businessmen, the entrepreneurs are supposed to figure out things like this. And they do. The ones that don't get weeded out. The ones that are good at this, who haven't been in the market before, now get weeded in. You know, they start getting planted in, or whatever the appropriate metaphor is here. So they jump into the market and they start solving the problem. Some of them become experts, financial newsletters. Aha. Why don't we wind it up on inflation? It's a good place to stop. So the final results are the state is either going to stop, well, it can do 3 things. It can try to contract the money supply, and once or twice it's done that, and like after the Napoleonic Wars, and you have deflation, and the whole thing reverses. So rare we won't even worry about it. The second possibility is it simply keeps inflating at the same rate, and there we get that sort of Fisherite concept with the price level, except it doesn't necessarily match the price level. Whatever level they happen to be getting away with inflating, they'll just keep doing it. In which case you have constant rate of inflation, the government just lives off of that as a form of taxation, and that's that. But the third possibility is they like what they call the fiscal policy results. They like not just the monetary policy, but they like the effects on the economy, like this boom. They like shooting up the junk and getting the rush. And that's when you get the cycle not just going like this, but like this. And what happens, of course, they inflate higher and higher. They have to be unanticipated. They have to be not guessed. They have to have fool the entrepreneurs and pump in ever larger doses of money. Now, what happens if you do that with heroin or morphine, right? It's called ODing. What happens in the economy when you do that? You hit what? Now, I don't have the German word handy here. It's maybe in your manual.
Kraken open Inflationen.
But in fact, kaput, that Austrian economics and what von Mises had in German translated English is crack a boom. And that happened in 1923 in Germany, and it not only wiped out the Deutschmark entirely, you start all over again with brand new currency. And during the last stages, of course, they were not even using the paper money, they were using foreign money or gold or whatever they had stashed away. But the economy just blows up entirely, the money just vanishes. Now, notice that even in Germany in 1923, when you say the economy blew up, everybody didn't stop working, everybody didn't stop investing, everybody didn't stop doing things. Even with incredible dislocations and the inability to predict price levels, they still continued on. And how they continued on and why it survived is, of course, the topic for tomorrow, counter-economics. Because, in fact, that's what they did. The system, in the sense of a legal political system tightly around an economy, broke down. And that is the advantage. That is the positive result, the silver lining, the whole counter-economic concept, which will lead to agorism that we're talking about. This is the worst the state can do in economics. Ultimately, this is the living end, the bitter end, the cross at the end of the rainbow, whatever you want to call it, the worst, the ODing of incredible monetary control. This, in fact, even scares statists, so that nowadays the Rockefellers and so forth will cut back on inflation and accept a certain amount of depression and watch a few politicians get their heads chopped off, rather than face that as an end resort. We recently went through that. It looked like we were going to go into a crack-up boom in the early 70s, and instead they put in Jimmy Carter Ford first on Jimmy Carter ran a recession, got that over. They call it, by the way, depression such a harsh word that we have to keep changing it with euphemisms. We go from depressions, then we have just recessions, and then recession became too harsh a word, and it became rolling readjustments.
Yeah.
Sideways waffling.
Yeah.
Favorite one's stagflation.
Stagflation. Yeah, the Austrians predicted that. None of the other economists did. Where you could have, if you think about why this is going on, it's obvious where you could have both. Because if you're inflating so fast at such a rate that the malinvestment can't be liquidated, you still got the stagnation from the malinvestment liquidation while you're already shooting up the next round for the inflation. Well, as long as the system can stand it. Like how long can you keep shooting up bigger and bigger doses of drug, right? Shoot more and more horse up. And eventually when your system breaks down, that's when it ends.
The one difference, Sam, in the metaphor of drug use is that with drug use in individuals, there are many individuals who don't use any, some who can handle it in small amounts and never increase, and then some who have to keep increasing until it kills them or something. The difference with the state is that the ones that aren't power junkies stay out of it, the ones who can handle small amounts of it become bureaucrats, and the real power junkies automatically rise to the top. In other words, it's not a question of if, but a question of when it will eventually lead to destruction.
Yeah, except that it's not as obvious as it used to be. I mean, it seemed to us for a time, I must admit I was bitten by the same bug in this, that the state would always end up in some sort of catastrophic collapse of that form. And in one sense, when we get to the Agorist, the very end of this entire intensive, when we get to the Agorist revolution concepts, which we're only going to touch at the edge of and leave you hanging there, you will find that in a sense this will always happen, but it won't happen the same way. We're talking in the German situation and so forth. We're talking about situations where the people have not rejected the state. That the idea of the state is still in their mind. They're only rejecting the money supply. And in that case, the state still has room to play with. And what will happen, it turns out, depending on the strength of the ruling class, they can control this to some extent. They can rein it in. It depends on how powerful they are, how well their ideology is grounded. Ideology in this sense means how well they can mystify everybody into buying whatever line they're selling. So it is possible for them to shift their line with enough cleverness, enough collaborators of the intelligence, the class of intellectuals. Intellectual, by the way, why has that got a bad term? Because in fact most of them have been bought out by the state and they have become parrots for the statist line. That's why the term has become negative. In Russia, it was called intelligentsia, and it was almost a universal swear word, because almost every one of them were either princes or on the take of the nobility or right after the Russian Revolution. And of course even past that, although they're trying to change their name. Well, this sounds like actually a pretty good way to go. We covered a lot of economics that at one point I was going to take for granted, but since with the questions kept going and asking to expand on it, we ended up covering essentially everything I was going to cover anyway. So, tomorrow we'll jump right into counter-economics. I'm not going to assume you understand economics, so if not, you can of course try and ask questions. Perhaps I'll even start off that way tomorrow morning to make sure that there's something didn't creep into your minds overnight and you sound stark in your bed saying, wait a minute, what about that? How did he get away with explaining that? Or that's not going to work. I don't see how that comes at all. So if that happens, we'll jump to that. Otherwise, I'll go straight into counter-economics tomorrow and explain the theory, where it came about and how it works, and then go on to the important part, which we'll spend the latter part of the day on, of actually using it. I'll go through examples of it, what's being used in society today, and then perhaps you want to float some hypothetical businesses at me or ideas you might have, and we can work some of those out. And then Sunday we'll go on, as I said, to integrate all this into Agorism. Remember later. There's one concept that comes up a lot in Austrianism. It's a concept that's called marginal utility. Now, one of the interesting things about it is it contains a word that is not otherwise used in Austrianism. It's a term that, the second part of this word, comes from classical economics. And it's not used because, in a sense, the concept of utility was an earlier attempt to get to subjective values. So the best way of thinking of this is sort of marginal subjective value. But for historical reasons, it's called marginal utility. I have noticed, I don't know how many of you keep up with the libertarian economic literature, and particularly the financial newsletters, where these things are in dynamic application at all times. But some of these people, believe it or not, confuse these concepts. They're linked very strongly, but they're not the same. Okay, subjective value simply says that what you value is based in subjectivity, and therefore attempts to make it objective in a certain sense of labor, or that there's some sort of quark of value that's inherent in everything and can be added up intrinsically, don't exist. That's That's true. Marginal, however, the concept of marginal utility is quite different. When it's, if you remember, I sort of was doing things like that when we were talking about people wanting to make an exchange, and you have a person A and a person B, and they have a list of things which they value, and each of their value tables are somewhat different. Okay, now what happens if if A and B have more than one of the same item? In fact, in most cases in the real world, that's exactly the situation you're dealing with. If A has one, these are tables of projected value, in case somebody's worrying about such things. Let's say the difference, I think I covered in the primer, but anyway, if A has one sheep and it's the only sheep in the world, it's probably incredibly valuable to A. A does not want to give it up. B might have, let's say, a pasture of land, and if B has to give up this whole pasture for A's sheep, well, B would be without pasture. B may do other things on it. Maybe he has cows or likes to mow the lawn or something. For whatever reason, if it's one sheep versus one pasture, darn unlikely things will trade. And just the fact of the subjective value of these items and the fact that they have them. It might happen. They might cut a deal of some kind. But let's say the other possibility exists that A has 10 sheep. Okay. And furthermore, B comes up with the intelligent idea of subdividing pasture. Okay, so that his, well, for ease of division, we'll say he has 12 quarters. Or 12, whatever they want to call quarters. Obviously needs a fourth, but it's also a land for 12 units of in which he chooses to divide it. Now, the interesting thing is that the way frequent subjective value works is that they tend to value the 10th item less than the 9th item, less than the 8th, all the way down to 1. If they give away which one is the 10th is irrelevant, and I mean, we're assuming equivalence, that these are all equivalent elements. So that it is the 10th item that they will value much less than, and trade off. The last one they've acquired becomes the first one they're willing to give up. Furthermore, if B is thinking of his pasture in terms of multiple units, he could easily give up this 12th one in exchange for one sheep. Maybe he'll take that sheep and put it on another part of his land. And A is quite happy with 9 sheep, feeding on land and producing whatever it needs to be produced for him. And this kind of exchange goes on in all areas. Whenever you're sitting there with the amount of money you're going to spend, you're not thinking of spending, well, this is my last dollar. Or say if you're a person, if you go up to somebody, can you lend me a cigarette? And they say, this is my last cigarette. You immediately say, oh, well, I won't take that one. Well, what's so special about that cigarette? I mean, it's physically identical with all other cigarettes in the world. And unfortunately, there are very few gourmet cigarettes, as you know. So it's roughly identical. And to these, to many smokers, many of the common chain smokers, unfortunately, they do perceive them as quite identical. They don't care what they get, if it's a Scotch pie or a plain wrapped cigarette or Players or whatever. So the point is, well, why this last one? What's so important about it? Because, again, marginal utility. You're now down here and not up here. If you have a brand new pack of cigarettes, hey, that 20th or 25th if you're in Canada, doesn't matter too much, but when you get down to the last one, it suddenly becomes incredibly valuable to you. You don't know when you'll get to the next one, for example. And similarly with the land, if B has to get down to his last quarter here, and he's, he and his perhaps wife and child are living on this with their dog and feeding a few chickens, and they're going to be real reluctant to rent out or give up that last one, but the first one, heck, they got, the other 11, 12s here, no big deal. Okay, that's the basic concept of marginal utility. And the reason this is so important, besides the obvious fact that we're just dealing here for calculation purposes, is that all exchanges occur on the margin. In the real world, all trades, all exchanges always occur on the margin. You never are dealing with the cases of my only item, my last item, and so forth. The only cases that happens is what's called collectibles, and the Henry Georges get all worked up and bothered about it. But that's when you have a unique item, i.e. a painting which can never be reproduced. The artist conveniently died right afterwards and became a masterpiece. One of the reasons that people like their artists to die off is because they can create this unique situation and thus have this item down here on the bottom of their subjective value table, or bottom I should say over here. Okay, just for completion then, I've now covered every, I believe, important concept that you need in Austrian economics, with marginal utility being the sort of flash finish. It applies to actually everything we've talked about because I mean, if your interest, again, it's the money that you're lending out. A capitalist is not going to lend out his last dollar that maintains his lifestyle, whether it's the Howard Hughes level or a somewhat more restrained level. And if you're renting, as I use the land concept here, again, you're renting on the margin. You tend to rent out what you feel is the extra or least valuable, whatever, to you, the one that you value the least. Now, again, the only reason you value the least is because of the quantity, because you have more than one. Not that there's anything magical or distinguishable. In fact, if there is anything distinguishable, it is not a marginal utility case. If it's anything that you consider significantly distinguishable, and you're going to value it uniquely and independently, and it will be a different case. Okay, so much for review. I think that might refresh your memories.
Now, while you're at that point, I'd like to point out that I have a great view of the glare of the screen, totally indistinguishing any characters on the screen whatsoever from the blackboard.
Uh-huh. Is that
So
true?
you could either
How does the
change
rest
the
of
angle
you?
of the...
Is that a unique reflection for him?
I have some there. I think perhaps if the right-hand side of the chalkboard was brought closer to the audience by a matter of 2 or 3 inches, it might make a significant difference.
Like that?
Why don't you
Yeah,
write
better.
something on it so we can tell?
Right, test. This is a test.
A snap quiz, right?
That's an enormous improvement. Yeah.
Okay.
That small adjustment was done.
Uh-huh,
Thank
that's
you.
good, Sam.
Okay. By the way, I'm bowing to modern English or American English because, of course, as we all know, the word should be
Or just an O with an umlaut on it.
perhaps in German, but not even. But
Economics.
this goes back to Greek and Latin. It's a diphthong, O-E, so it should be C-O, not C-E, but we don't. Anyway, a little bit of extra history free of charge. Okay, what is the counter-economy, what's counter-economics, and why are we making all this fuss about it? As I alluded to when we brought in a concept called the state yesterday, there is, just at that time I said that if the state didn't exist, what we talked about yesterday is all we need to know. That's it. We can build everything we know, and we can just refine it further and further. We can make investments, keep historical data, keep track of the whole thing. And that's as far as we need to go. All right, so state comes along. What happens? Well, there has been an evolution. In the beginning, when the state was sort of crude and primitive, as you remember, I pointed out that it could be considered it was a barbarian gang, riding around and looting and pillaging. It got religion, or actually took over religion, so to speak, and imposed itself on these farming communities and so forth. Some of the things that it attacked were primitive marketplaces. In Greek, the word is agora, or as some insist on calling it agora. And the agora just simply means an open marketplace. Now, of course, open is this sort of geographical term. That is to say, it wasn't enclosed or inside of a building or something, but it has, at least when you say it in English, an additional association or component. An open marketplace in economics is one that doesn't have things like barriers to entry. A simple economic concept. I hope you've all heard of it sometime or another. Anyway, the agora, these barbarians would attack, whatever was around, and agoras or marketplaces. If they could hit it on a good market, they would probably be an excellent place to make a raid because people would concentrate their wealth there and bring it in there for trade purposes. Trade goes back as far as we know, at least as far as farming, and perhaps even before that. Picking a specific place for it is somewhat more recent. Around these agorae, became villages, towns, and eventually the whole concept of urban living, and what we then eventually decide to call, for historical, classical purposes, civilization. Civilization is a derivative of the marketplace. One of the principles, or one of the, actually, I guess an axiom at this point, of Austrian economics, or even before Austrian economics, praxeology, is why does any of this exist? Why do people bother to trade? Why doesn't everybody live as an individual unit? Why doesn't everybody follow the John Fresnor way of life and decide to completely divorce himself from everybody else? Well, there's a thing called division of labor. This is not unique to Austrianism, but what is interesting about it is that, according to von Mises, division of labor is the glue of society. This is the reason that people bother to live in villages or towns or anything else built up from the agora. Because if I concentrate on one thing and somebody else concentrates on another, we can exchange. Okay. We can trade. And each of us will end up producing more. Our relative subjective values, our individual subjective values will be maximized by doing this sort of thing. This is, again, just sort of elementary economics. And it comes from the law of not only the absolute, but comparative advantage is not only true of wealth in trade between nations, but also between individuals. In fact, one of the things that Austrians and even Friedmanites accept is that whatever applies to an individual applies to countries. So that if you say something's true about free trade between countries, it's just as true about between free trade between individuals or between Agora 1 and Agora 2, wherever they happen to be located. Agora 2 might have a lot of people in a rocky area which build a mine and cut up minerals and stuff and bring it to market. Agora 1 has all these farmers coming in and from different farms and feeding in from their little communities. They might live in a village which does nothing but have farmers in it, where they have their huts around for protection against these barbarians who are riding around and committing acts of predation. Okay, so this is a primitive society, and if the state, well, if the barbarians don't ride through, a few years go by, people get accustomed to not having it, don't expect it, there's no anticipation, then we have essentially a free society. Maybe not a terribly technological one. It might get that way if it was left alone long enough, who knows. Or it might just be wedded to the old ways and continue along without much change over a few centuries. And in fact, that's what pretty much happened. So you just essentially have this sort of society, occasional traders going back and forth, the beginnings of merchant class, caravans, bourgeoisie. But the state, when it enters the picture, changes the whole, as we said, and there's no such thing as an economically neutral state. There's no entity that can do the things the state does and not have an economic impact. The moment it enters the economy, regardless of how primitive, it causes a sort of, well, a split in all the transactions. Again, the economy is human action. It is the sum of all interactions, sum of human action, at least in the material world. If one wants to talk about other areas, I suppose one could leave spirituality out or something, although a lot of organizations seem to be able to make a lot of money out of even that. If you attempt to join a church or a cult, depending on your point of view, they seem to have a certain economic component. They want large amounts of donations. They have to build their buildings and theater streets and so forth. So it does seem to have almost everything to do with all human action, the sum of all human action. If the state intervenes, the state, of course, is committing acts of action, and I mean, they may be inhuman action from some people's point of view, but they're committed by human actors. And regardless of how inhumane it is, they now carve out a status sector. There's another part of the economy which may or may not be left behind. Okay, as I said, in primitive times, this whole concept of the state had to evolve. So you had a period of time when there was just predation, so it would just rip off a big chunk of the economy, and go off, and what was left over was left over. Some of the people, after being hit a couple times by barbarians, decided they would stash their food, hide their grain, send the young women out into the bushes, and here come the barbarians, and come back in a couple of weeks when they're gone. And those who did so, obviously, were pro-survival, the first survivalists, right? They kept their food or gold or a mixture thereof stashed between, they learned to build basements and dungeons and all that neat stuff, and hidey holes and what have you. Some of them might appeal to the most powerful farmer who had several, incredibly tough sons, and the barbarians generally didn't bother them too much, and so they would maybe store their stuff there and pay the guy a little extra to keep it preserved. Or some of them might even hire some of the barbarians who wanted to go straight and enter civilized society and so forth, and form a guard. So there are all sorts of little market transactions that could have occurred in those days. But those who kept their their goods, their produce, and their wealth and material and immaterial and so forth, and their people out of the hands of the state were the first counter-economists. This is where it all began. They were the part of the economy that was not under the state's control. Well, when these barbarians settled down, took over established churches or established them themselves, and became convinced, psyched out, whatever you want to call it, the people into bringing their tribute on a regular basis without having to hunt them down and execute them too often, to make examples, you would have a permanent status sector. It wasn't just a rip off and run off, but it now became a sort of a big bloated parasite sitting there with its, veins and things, the kind of, as you've seen an alien where it shoots out and goes into the forehead and sucks away, So all of this became into all those various human actors. This is the state. They're busily devouring your precious economic bodily fluids. But it did so on a regular basis. It evolved, if you wish. And this is where we really go over to the modern concept of state begins at this point. And it was modern pretty early. We can get into, I think there needs to be more research done, but my understanding at this point in revisionist history is we had a very high-level culture, the Phoenicians, who were almost entirely traders. It's true they had a sort of government in their home areas, but they were most of the time, they were out on the Mediterranean Sea where nobody can enforce anything anyway, and it was ridiculous to attempt to, so that these ships were pretty much units, independent political units unto themselves, and they sailed far and wide. They had a technology beyond everyone else. The alphabet was Phoenician. Everybody learned it because why? Because of economic reasons to learn it. Why should you learn anything? Why should you be sitting in this class? Why should you have taken in a free world? Why should you even bother going to school to learn how to read, write, speak, and so forth? Well, because you communicate with others and you make money, and there's a lot of profit in becoming a scribe. So the Phoenicians went around. They were traders. They weren't farmers in this case. They were performing these acts, more high-level economic acts, actually. And upon them, again, I'm simplifying. There are a lot of things going on with Babylonians and Greeks, Macedonians. But the particular group that I'm interested in, and historically, was a group called the Romans. And what the Romans were a totally parasitical society. As far as I know, I can't think of anything outside of the sector of the state that they are known for having created. They got a great culture, but they took it entirely from the Greeks. They managed to set up their empire by conquering essentially everything the Phoenicians had set up in the Mediterranean. All the interconnected trade routes, all the communications, transport, and so forth, the links were set up by the Phoenicians, and the Romans sort of marched through the areas and conquered them one by one. They also, when they hit the Far East, they found the older decadent empires, which undoubtedly went through the same phases much earlier, and had it out with the Persians and Parthians and Seleucians and eventually the Ptolemaics, and you get the Cleopatra and Antony stories. So the Romans are interesting because they developed what is not only is developed a modern version of the state, because from then on you can see you can take any state from Rome on and see exactly where it matches. In fact, they were the template. And not only that, other states that followed deliberately and consciously copied Rome. They had really got it set up well. They took over, in fact, they not only took over the Phoenicians. The Carthaginians were the last the Phoenician outpost. And they went off to the Carthage, although somewhat decadent. They weren't all Agoric at that time, but they still were pretty much based on trade rather than on conquest. And the Romans conquered them as well, and at one point decided they were going to exterminate them. They leveled the city of Carthage and destroyed the remnants of it, lest people remember a different age. And then they went through all the modern problems of statism. They, as far as I know, had the first attempt at money. They had, well, Lydia was before them, but they really expanded it all through this empire. They ran then into the next problem, price controls. Diocletian is the first known case that I know of, at least, in which an attempt to maintain price controls was put throughout the empire. The monetary expansion,
What's Diocletian?
Diocletian, Emperor Diocletian. He was
Oh,
Caesar.
that's a person?
Mm-hmm. Well, have to knock off one of the farms here. Yeah, the state overconsumed that one.
On the name of progress.
Yeah.
Right.
Up until the time of Diocletian, pretty much, even the Roman state, as I said, had only a certain sector. They would sort of sit in the economy and occupy part of it. And the rest of it just simply wasn't thought about. There was all sorts of people running around doing all sorts of things. And it was partly protected, and kind of perversely almost, by the class structure. These societies up until very recently were highly class-oriented. This is something modern Americans are about the only people in the world you have to explain this to, because every other society throughout, until you go back to the most primitive times, is totally class-ridden. It's an incredible modern achievement that we live in a relatively classless society. Not totally, but relatively. There's still some remnants of class existing, and there's a large covert upper class in the society too. Anyway, until even with the Romans, with Diocletian and so forth, you begin to penetrate more into the rest. They became not interested in merely their tribute and their aristocrats sitting there waxing fat over that, occasionally dragging some of these people in here to go off and fight wars. But you begin to get more interpenetration into the rest of the economy. The Romans also had the first explicit class, as I said, all these societies are class-ridden, but the Romans are the first that I know of, again, to explicitly define what is nowadays called the middle class. They call them the equus from
Horse.
yeah, horse, knight, and so forth, the equestrian, that background. And they were, of course, very small to begin with, but they grew. They were not only the merchants, but the professionals, what would now be called lawyers, and I guess some doctors. Medicine was. Actually, medicine began then too. We had Galen figuring out things like arterial systems. So it was also the smallest and weakest class. The largest were the plebeians, and they actually had some power. Just collectively, they were the mob. And then, of course, you had the upper class, patricians in the beginning. So all the things that we have nowadays sort of began here. With Diocletian, you had control. Now, one of the things that happened when Diocletian started this type of price controls, and it didn't last, it was like on and off. They kept trying different things. They were making all the mistakes to be made with. Right at the beginning, they didn't have Milton Friedman telling them how they could make their state more efficient and collect more taxes if they loosened up a bit, or Arthur Laffer drawing curves for them, saying they should cut the marginal tax rate. So they just went through all this pretty crudely. And what happened is, interestingly enough, now again remember that although they did have a fairly large, extensive urban society in Agora, and they did undoubtedly have a counter-economy in the cities, especially among the underclass. One of the things is that these underclasses, the lower classes, the ones who were being oppressed, had everything. I mean, they had their own culture, their own way of talking, completely different from the aristocrats, even though they might be exactly the same ethnic background. They would just develop totally independently. And so in a sense, that was not only counter-economy, counter-culture, and all the rest of it already existed. If you think of the Egyptian society, the pyramid builders, I won't bother putting an I in this one. The pyramid, the guys drawing the blocks and so forth, slave society. But even slaves, the thing about slavery is that, which is, again, a human institution that comes until incredibly recently, about 2-3 centuries at most that we've been rid of it. And in some parts of the world it's still around, of course. But the idea of even abolishing it is only a couple centuries old. So there was a whole slave class. I mean, that's an underclass in a sense, because in the social pyramid, but of course, even among the slaves, although technically they couldn't own property, they could still use their labor occasionally. They could do things like slouch and become and shiftless and drag their feet and drawl and all the things that people who are oppressed will learn to do to weaken their amount of oppression, to lower the value that's extracted from them as forms of resistance. And then you get the plebes, or peasants, or the people that have allowed to own things at least. Interestingly enough, women come in somewhere between here in the Roman society. They had a really interesting way, a very statist concept of women. The idea that, okay, the main thing as far as they were concerned is women existed to provide more soldiers for the state. Okay, that was their basic position. So if a woman provided, I forgot what it was, 7 males or something, they were considered as good as a man from then on, and were allowed to own property and inherit and all the neat stuff.
That's why there's so many children named Octavian. Number 8, I'm free.
Could well be, yeah. Good point. Okay, well, anyway, that's one of these underclasses. And a lot of the times the underclasses happen to be different color. I'm sure if we had better records of some of the black empires in the Zimbabwe area, they would undoubtedly had light-skinned slaves, but it was just a question of making them easier to spot. If you could tell somebody was a different shade or different color, different skin, easily spottable, you could say, hey, run away, that guy hasn't any chains on him. Must be a runaway slave, and we can easily hunt him down. So that, even in these societies, they had their own different culture. And in a sense, what I'm going to talk about when we get to the modern counter-economics existed to some extent in these. They existed because these cultures were just considered separate. The aristocrats just assumed the poor were different than them, and they weren't aristocrats. And so there was obviously something wrong with them, and so they had a different culture, and so forth. And so they also committed different economic acts. Well, again, with Diocletian and the later Roman Empire, this interpenetration, this increased statism, the use of money, for example, which almost everybody used, even slaves undoubtedly could secrete some money about them. Speaking of which, another example, in the Middle East, even today, there are these old Muslim laws around that women aren't allowed to own fixed property. That is to say, they can't own land and so forth. But they are allowed to carry anything they can carry around. So you find that women in the Middle East have all these, jewels and gold earrings and bracelets and everything constantly hanging from them at all times, because as long as they got it on them, they can keep it. It's theirs. They have to have, all their wealth has to be on them at all times, as part of the deal. I guess they're allowed to take it off to go to bed. But
And whatever they're wearing on their wedding day is theirs.
Which is, so.
Not their husbands.
Baubles, bangles, and beads. So that's why the Middle Eastern women appear to have this garish aesthetic. It's economically derived in their own form of wealth conservation. Okay, well, with the interpenetration of the state into the economy on a vast scale, we have the first real breakup. In fact, this led to the breakup of the Roman Empire, because what happened is, it's easy, relatively easy, to enforce these types of controls in a concentrated urban area where you've got a lot of informers. Even among the lower classes, you build up a whole network and state. You get secret police, which developed at this time, and all sorts of methods of investigation. They started working out the equivalent of tax forms to fill out. And that's fine as far as Rome goes, as far as maintaining Rome and Byzantium and the big urban areas. But unfortunately, the society was largely an urban society. I mean, a rural society was economically based on peasantry. And so what happened was, the agoras became to a large extent big cities. The farm areas just sort of kind of hived off. What happened is when they enforced price controls and the price controls mostly hit farmers, there was all sorts of subsidies to placate the city mobs, because if the city mob could be stirred up by a politician, he could overthrow the existing Caesar or whatever and put himself into power. There was a lot of power struggles going on. And the farms, so these big manors, what happened was first of all, the farmers didn't want to send their produce to market, because if they sent it to market, it was enforced under price controls with rapid inflation going on. That meant that they would lose money, and so they would they'd rather just keep it at home and trade amongst themselves in their little villages. So you've got the city, the urban areas, Byzantium and Rome and so forth, send out their troops to go to these farming communities and seize the goods and bring them into market, as part of the price control mechanism. And of course, therefore, these rural outlying areas began to build up their own armies to defend themselves, and this, of course, created what became known as feudalism. So we had a setback. The Roman state, the parasite, finally, in a sense, killed the host. And the Roman Empire fell. It had nothing to do with Christianity. It had nothing to do with a lot of other factors that Gibbon and other people speculated on. In fact, it was the beginning, it was a reform of resistance. These farms, these rural areas that split off, did in fact result from I was going to say, it's not, again, I'm going to use counter-economics in a modern sense, but it's a counter-economic concept. It was resistance from the state and an attempt to get away from it, and they could do it by a form of secession within the society. In this case, it was more geographically coherent than the modern version would be. But this is where it evolved from. And these farms, when they broke down to the manorial system, where you had these baronies, which is the most common unit, you would have robber barons riding around and marching and conquering and so forth, with the central state no longer able to prevent small competitors from moving in and taxing again. So you sort of reverted back to this earlier version of barbarians. attacking it. And so you built up this combination of, residual aristocrats whose second and third and fourth sons had nothing better to do than fight, so they became the officer class of knights. And notice knight, horse, again, a derivative of the equus class. A lot of middle-class people came from the aristocracy, but they themselves wouldn't remain in it because there wasn't enough to go around, primogeniture, entailment, and all that stuff we talked about. So the lower, the younger sons and so forth became the beginnings of the middle class in all these societies. But occasionally you get smart peasants working their way up too, but it tended to be a downward rather than an upward movement socially. Okay, well that's a quick look at history and how we moved to the modern stage. What happens is, after the feudal period ends, there is a constant growth throughout the Middle Ages. There's a constant growth throughout the Middle Ages of trade. The building of trade built up the market. In the Middle Ages, of course, there was some differences even between a given baronies, and some of them, like very early, like Flanders and so forth, developed a heavy clothing industry, a lot of cottage industry, and they would, of course, trade to these others for their basic agricultural things or whatever. So you get some internal trade here. And everybody prized the stuff they could get from the east because there's a big difference in what was produced from east to west. And so some stuff would come in this direction, and I'm not sure exactly at the moment remember what they wanted to buy from the west, but there was a constant trade. These caravans would go over long distances. Most of you have seen the Marco Polo special last year, and Marco Polo was trying to improve the trade routes out here. Occasionally they would even go down to the unexplored, uncivilized areas, tribal areas, Africa. Some say there was exploration of the Americas even at this time. The Phoenicians are rumored to have made it once or twice over there. And Phoenicians, in fact, back in their time, when places like England were a backward tribal area, used to go up there, so they would spread themselves around. So you have a constant buildup of this exchange and trade. And even though civilization, or at least the Roman civilization, took a nosedive, the economies continued progressing in spite of it. There was some setbacks from falling empires and attempts to build new empires. The Roman Empire was an ideal that the statists were constantly trying to get back to. The Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne, the Byzantine Empire of the Greeks, which later became the model for the Russians. Tsar means Caesar, Kaiser means Caesar. All these statist terms for themselves were trying to rechristen and bring back the Roman Empire. Part of it was kept through the religions, or the two big established churches. But the idea retained. However, they did not succeed in doing it. The Charlemagne's empire fell apart. The Eastern Roman Empire fell, constantly subject to attacking Muslims, whether they were Arabs in the caliphates, and then later the Turks and so forth that were converted. They created empires the old-fashioned way. People like Attila and Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. They were literally the barbarians out from the Eastern Asian hills, and they would sweep down, reimpose their controls and so forth. And at the moment they'd done so, they started picking up these ideas that left over from the Roman and, in some cases, earlier empires in the East, and just reimpose the same type of structure. They would all follow this cycle of conquest and institutionalization and then decadence. And thus you get people in modern times like Oswald Spengler, who talks about has a cyclic view of history. And he sees, as far as he's concerned, history is political. He doesn't think of the economic aspects. And so he always sees this rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. Well, from our modern, enlightened Austrian economic viewpoint with a touch of counter-economics, we now understand why this is always going to happen. Because the state, the great parasite, forms itself on a society, sucks away at its fluids, and eventually the thing collapses, it dies, and a new one has to be imposed. So you get this rise and fall, and thus you have the cyclic theory of history. A little extra bonus here in your course. Oswald Spengler explained in 3 minutes. Well, we get to modern, we're moving rapidly now to modern times. What happens is these baronies begin to be, first of all, as always, conquest follows trade. So as the trade increased more and more rapidly between the local areas, the baronies sort of became duchies, larger units, and the duchies eventually were as the rapidity of communication and transport increased with a progressive economy, it was also possible along these same communication routes to have things like cavalry and troops and stuff impose themselves at a better level, keep track of who was running your province way over there and so forth. So once again, a new state began to grow, and in fact several of them, they brought back the concept of king, which is pretty old, and or they had titular kings at the time, but they weren't terribly powerful. And once again, the states begin to rise in the period exactly, almost immediately after the rapid growth of modern trade. You get, following it, the return of the great parasite, the state, and what's called, because of a slightly new concept, the nation-state. Now, there is a departure here. This is one of the beginning of many excuses for statism. The state, as you will see, always revives itself by bringing in or adopting some new ideology. When the old one doesn't work anymore, and you can't keep people buying existence that has a right to exist and rip them off, they come up with a new idea. Until the nation-state, states were all forms of empires, whether even the Roman Western empires or the older Eastern ones. They were polyglot. They had all sorts of tribes in them. There was just the state where wherever the people had conquered, they ruled, and the people either accepted it or they couldn't think of any good reason why they shouldn't, so they just left and went off into the bushes or went off to a kingdom that wasn't so bad. There was no clash of ideologies or people working out, well, this is why we should have a state, and the other guy says, no, I think we shouldn't have a state, and here's some good reasons for that. People hadn't evolved to that level. But as thought progressed, as studies of societies progressed, the old empires couldn't hack it anymore. And although some of them held on until pretty recently, the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire in particular were highly polyglot, and they lasted until the World War I. Most of the rest of the Western countries, which were post-Renaissance, had to find a new concept. They couldn't bring back the old empires because people just weren't going to buy it. So they came up with the idea of the ultimate extended family, the multiple poly-tribe, where we were all one group. And you'll notice that even today, in the 20th century, and even in the United States, which is really a polyglot empire, except that they have papered that over with tremendous amount of ideological craft. Nation, they talk about one nation under God, or one nation under something, but one nation, we are all one, we have got to think as one, we must be united, we must put aside our petty differences so we can get into our important differences, and go to war against these other people that have more important differences. Okay, so this is the beginning of that concept, and the nation-state was in a sort of conflict with the empires, but it was a kind of conflict that attempted to justify its existence, why it should be there at all. A lot of this interstate war or conflict used this type of thing, their excuses for existence. Until that point, the main thing that kept states going was still that legacy of established religion. And when the Reformation came in around this time, some of these states picked up on the new remodeled, streamlined, shiny chromium Protestant religions. And the reason they picked it up is that they can then, each of these tribal entities, each of these nations could have their very own religion. Otherwise, if they were all under the great one holy Catholic Church, then it wasn't as easy to fight. But once they became a different religion, well, they couldn't let those damn heretics come in here and run your life. You have to allow us, who are the same religion as you, run your life. So you've got to go out there into man the barricades and stop them from conquering it. So on and on, the state's ideologies kept evolving over a period of time. But again, the market was also evolving. So we have this constant growth of trade. Right around after this time, we get into exploration of the New World, colonization, and the state following behind, pursuing it regularly. And so here we come towards our modern period. Well, I think we'll just collapse the rest of history so we can get right into it. What happened in the period following the 1700s is when the critical occurrence happened. As I mentioned the other day, Adam Smith in 1776. The year of 1776 was also known for an act of declaration of independence in the colonial areas. And the rebellion, which had actually began in 1775, picked up steam. And so these things sort of came together. And for the first time, you went beyond the nation-state and religious empire to the modern concept of ideological states. The first clear-cut ideological back state is, interestingly enough, the United States. The American state was born in a rush of ideology. The ideology apparently seemed to be quite against the concept of the state, but in fact it ended up rebuilding and creating a strong state within that area that had begun by secession. That trick was put, that little bit of sleight of hand was pulled off by implying that this entity, which was the state itself, was somehow necessary to defend the people from itself. I'm stating it quite baldly because that's what in fact it did, but how it did it was, of course, by doing it in a much more elaborate way with a lot more rhetoric and a lot of fine-sounding, high-ringing phrases. At the time it was imposed, a lot of the people at the time already began to, at the same time, simultaneously, this was happening, did perceive what was going on. It was only at this time the murky way the world worked was beginning to be clarified a bit, and both sides began to see the issue. And you get the so-called Federalists, who were expressing one side of it, the pro-state side, why they should build a nation-state, why they should turn the United States. So the colonies, even at the time, were highly polyglot. There was definite, the British emulated, they loved the Romans. The whole British Empire concept, which we could get into and spend a whole, course on revisionist history and nothing but the British Empire, because they're the most interesting, emulated the Romans. They wanted to build a Roman-style empire. Their empire was polyglot. It was, they used nationalism internally within England. But around the world, they were busily imposing their version of white English rule on everybody who was anything but white English. So when the Americans revolted, they revolted against it. And they revolted, the Federalists, originally when they were setting up their own state, they thought, well, the best way to sell is that, well, the later Romans somehow, for some reason, strayed from the path. They were, they became a bad state. We don't want to be into that. So let's say that we want, is the early Rome, Roman, they were the good part of Rome. And when was that? Well, it wasn't an empire yet. It wasn't all, controlling all sorts of areas. It was still like one that listened to the people, res publica. So we had the Roman Republic. And thus you have in the, in the 1700s in the United States, over 12, over, what is it, 17, 18, 1900 years after the Roman Republic, you had a Senate created out of nothing. Again, a conscious emulation of the Roman Republic. Many of the American political terms are consciously taken from Roman history. There was, in this period back, one more step back when we were talking about the rise of the nation-state, the Renaissance, and the rapid growth of merchant trading and so forth. During that period was also the rediscovery of the legacy of Roman Greece, what they what's now called humanism. Arose from the study of that, and that's part of the reason there was a Renaissance. A lot of old knowledge was being recovered. It wasn't lost. It wasn't. This is one of the interesting issues where some literary revisionist history comes in. People like C.S. Lewis argue that the Middle Ages weren't so dark and the Renaissance wasn't so light, and their clear-cut divisions weren't so blatantly obvious. And that's true. What happened really was that there was a change from the church-controlled. You remember I mentioned that cleric and clerk and all that was sort of synonymous terms. Everybody belonged to the church. Anybody could write. If you were right, you probably were a priest, or at least a monk, or somebody who worked for the church. Maybe there were a few professional scribes around. So they were kind of like the keepers of the knowledge, and they knew this stuff. I mean, it wasn't lost. It was in church control, but it sort of spread. The intellectual class grew because the merchant class grew, because they had more sons that could sit around and learn things, and they would kind of be attached to the church, but also operate on behalf of the great houses of Genoa and Venice and the Medicis. And these children could now served. They may be technically members of the church, but they're really serving their families. And so the knowledge began to spread. It began to move out of the churches and into the rest of society. That's what you were looking your watch for. Okay, so zooming into modern times.
Before you go on, Sam, I'm going to ask you something. You describe a cycle of excuses for a state. It appears our current one at least started as an ideological excuse.
And as I said, the first really,
yeah,
to do this.
And lately we've had the excuse of a variety of smaller excuses, the welfare excuse, the defensive excuse, but all these are falling apart. What's the next big excuse they're going to come up with?
My own prediction, you're jumping way ahead now.
The galactic protection excuse?
No, my idea is that in a sense there's going to be a throwback to what happened in the 1700s. As the excuses break down, as you say, they sort of become the sort of melding in people's minds. They begin to realize that all of these things are of a kind, regardless of how they're brought up. I think the ultimate excuse will be going back to square one and saying, well, what you really need the government for is to protect you from the government. And you obviously can't do without a government. Therefore, you need to have a government to protect you. And if that doesn't work, the final barricade is, well, put us in power to run the government, and we'll dismantle it for you. It'll take a while.
Is that the libertarian excuse?
Well, that's as I said, you jumped way ahead in the chorus, but yeah, I think that is this last stage of statism will be. And of course, we must maintain order until that's done. We can't have any violence or chaos while we're dismantling the state. So we're going to send out our troops and secret police to round up all the troublemakers while we're peacefully evolving out of the state. And of course, if they resist, we'll have to violently suppress them. And okay, so that's at the very end of this course. We're going to talk about the revolutionary implications of agorism. But in this time period, we had a proto-libertarianism. We had a concept of beginning concepts of freedom and so forth. And there was always some people thinking about such things and writing about them. I'm going to get into one of these days a whole revisionist history of classical liberalism. I don't think it's anywhere near as libertarian as a lot of people think. A lot of people nowadays say, well, we're the libertarians, we're the inheritors of classical liberalism. I'm not sure we want to be. I think we need to study that a lot more. What a lot of the classical liberals, going back far enough, the old Whigs, were aristocrats, and they were, although there was a bourgeoisie rising in England and so forth, the original Whigs were aristocrats, sort of nobles and lords. They were toying with the idea of how they could free up society for their own benefit. They just chafed under a little too much political control. They tended to pit themselves against the king. In a sense, the very first Whigs were the ones who imposed Magna Carta. And when people come back and say, well, look at the train from Magna Carta to the American Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence, if they're a little more hip, they're correct. There is indeed a train there going on, but it's one of the statists deciding how tightly the state should control things. Oh, this might be worth a little side trip right here. What is liberal statism versus conservative statism from an agorist point of view? If you go back to the barbarian model, the conservative statists are the ones that say, let's consume everything right now. Let's plunder, rape, murder, and so forth. The liberal statists, at least liberal in the old sense of the term, are the ones that say, let's hold back, let's restrain our appetite. We can plunder and consume and rape just enough to keep us going, enjoy life, but we'll leave a lot for the people to continue producing, so there'll be lots more to rip off and produce in the long run. So there's always this tension between between the liberal and the terms evolved somewhere in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and changed as the meaning went on. But this is sort of the original meaning. So the liberals are the ones who want to keep the appetite of the state restrained so that they can plunder more in the long run. And the conservatives are the ones who want what is now called, in the modern age, immediate gratification. Let's suppress, let's consume, let's go to war, let's do all these oppressive things now while we've got it. And of course, the state goes back and forth between these according to the perceived needs of the time. But they're just two wings of the same group.
Sam, something must have happened with the terms over time, because it seems like conserve, they were the ones who wouldn't have wanted to have blown it all in one quick action. They would have been the ones
That's true.
that
That's true. The term conservative evolved from an earlier group known as Tories. Originally, the terms were... It's interesting how political terms evolve. Because a Tory was a negative term, was a king's friend. And some implications of, brown nose would be, nowadays, I think, the concept. A Whig was a horse thief. That was the original meaning of Whig. And they just, started adopting, just like I called when the LPs came around, I called them party arcs, and next thing you know, they start calling themselves that. Not terribly original. these labels just sort of attract themselves that way. Yeah, each side tries to make themselves sound good, of course. And when the conservatives are conserving, what are they conserving? Okay, they're conserving the political order. That's above all conservatives are mostly concerned with conserving the political order, not the social. They might tie into social structure, but certainly not the economy. They're not interested in conserving conserving people having their own goods and their own possession. That is an extremely modern idea of conservatism. That was not the idea of conservatism for several centuries at all. They were conserving the only property they were conserving was the property of the aristocrats, of the big friends of the king or the aristocracy. And even that, you know, see evolve because the Whigs, in a sense, the Whigs became the conservatives. The Tories became a very tiny fraction of this. And there's even some crossover because you get in the evolution of the nation-state, the aristocracy became more and more vestigial, the landed aristocracy. Land became less and less an important component of the economy. The trade and eventually manufacture and finally modern industrial manufacture evolved over a period of time that became a larger and larger sector of the market. So what happened is the early bourgeoisie allied with, of all things, the king. This is a very common thing even in France and England, and certainly in Holland and well, anyways, the industrial areas, some areas of Germany, Austria. The natural alliance was often a three-way split of balancing of powers, where you would have these new bourgeoisie try to cut themselves in for a piece of the action of the state, and they would ally with the king against the aristocracy. So the Whigs in the beginning were not great free enterprisers and certainly weren't businessmen and bourgeoisie. They were aristocrats, as I said, with some ideas toying of liberty, and often the business would ally with the king and the Tories. It was not at all as clear-cut, you know, what we later perceived it as a conservative-liberal split. The actual terms conservative and liberal come about somewhat later. When they really were accepted, when they replaced these terms, it was at the time of the French Revolution. Okay, as late as the American Revolution, we still talked about Whigs. There was a group called the Rockingham Whigs under Lord Rockingham, who ruled England in the Parliament, and they were the ones who were sympathetic to the United States. And right after when the American Revolution happened, they were sort of thrown out, but several of their aristocratic members were things like generals and admirals in the fight, and they were very restrained on how they attempted to enforce their control in the American colonies. Murray Rothbard, in his Conceived in Liberty, talks about the history of this, and the Howe brothers in particular, who were attempting to occupy New York, were let George Washington escape from several different traps that they had been set for to work against the other faction of Whigs and Tories that had a coalition government, mainly. And when finally the British decided they were beaten in North America, the Rockingham Whigs were given another cabinet, allowed to go back into power, and they were the ones who negotiated at the end of the war. Lord North, actually, I don't think he was a Tory. I think he was just a different branch of Whigs. The Whigs were pretty dominant at that time. What happened was after that, the American Revolution and the French Revolution came along, this whole thing realigned, because that period is when everything became highly ideological. The French were inspired by what happened in the United States. The Latin Americans were inspired by it, and all throughout Europe, to a large extent, there was this whole ideological thing of restrain, limit, change over the government. And it wasn't just they didn't perceive it quite in terms that we would see it, at least with our libertarian view of nowadays. They had a lot of history that they had to deal with, and didn't have the viewpoint we had, so they would look out and say, there's kings, we want to get rid of these kings, they seem to be having a lot of rule. But it wasn't even clear-cut that they necessarily wanted to get rid of the kings. So for example, the French Revolution, they said, well, in England's pretty free too. Why don't we go and, if we had cut a deal with the king, as they have in England, we'd be better off, so get rid of these horrible aristos. So we could convince Louis to become a constitutional monarch like George in England, then we'd have a pretty good setup. So some of the more moderate French revolutionaries actually, and for about 3 years after the initial storming of the Bastille, Louis remained king in France, and they kept progressively limiting him. And he, of course, chafed on that because he was raised under the old absolute viewpoint and constantly intrigued in getting his power back. And meanwhile, the aristocrats were on both sides of this. Well, the evolution continues. With the French Revolution, then the state moves on to yet another round of ideology, And what happened is, I pointed out yesterday in sort of at the tail end there, is that the French revolutionaries were almost entirely enamored in the American experience and would all be considered to an extent proto-libertarians. They all believed in free enterprise, free trade, all this good economic stuff. And yet they ended up imposing, they ended up using as a temporary expedient paper money as assignats, mainly because they couldn't collect taxes out in the hinterlands. They went through that entire period, as I said, the Roman period, in an incredible short amount of time, because as soon as they put in paper money to finance things, they got into a war as all the monarchies around them tried to crush them and keep this republican idea from spreading. Well, that happened when they finally got rid of their king and became a republic. And so the next stage was financing a war, and war is, of course, extremely expensive, and although it was largely defensive, there was a slight imperialist aspect to it, the O'Neill Smith version of trying to impose freedom on all your neighbors. Once they felt threatened, they had plenty of volunteers rushing up singing La Marseillaise with the tricolor and going off to spread this wonderful idea of liberation to all the other European countries. And for some reason, all the bourgeoisie and peasants did not rise up spontaneously to get rid of their kings, and it became a long, protracted war. And in fact, it became the great classical liberals of the time, like Robespierre, ended up attempting to enforce the price controls and other government edicts by the use of mass executions. And you had Madame Guillotine feeding and Madame Defarge sitting there knitting while the heads were rolling. And these were all good liberals, good classical liberals, putting in their, using the mechanism of the state for supposedly improving the society and making it freer. Well, okay, so what happened from the French Revolution onward is that this ideology thing became an important issue, and how the states justified themselves. And for a while, this classical liberal idea became the issue. In England, I mentioned how the leagues broke up. The liberals under Fox were the people who supported, either sort of covertly or explicitly, in some cases, the radical liberals, the French Revolution, and that's where the liberal term really came about. These people all call themselves liberals at that time. And what happened was that the Burkean wing of the Whigs, and Burke was a Rockingham Whig, interestingly enough, he supported the American Revolution, swung over to join the remnants of the Tories, with all that was left of them, and they became the new Conservative Party, and that's how these two terms evolved in modern times. Liberals were originally the supporters of the French Revolution. The actual party of the French Revolution, there were several of them. There were Girondins and Jacobins. And the Jacobins are the ones that we remember the most. So that was that period, and ideology carrying into the field, it proved to be incredibly powerful, by the way. This, I think, should be mentioned too. First of all, the American colonies were pretty small and weak, and yet they managed to hold off the British Empire. That was fairly impressive. The French experience was even more powerful, because what happened is, as the state degenerated in France, and it went through that same thing as the Roman Empire did, as they attempted to impose price controls and the rest of the economic controls in Paris, the farmlands and hinterlands stopped sending food into the cities, and people had to be sent out there to confiscate it by force and stuff like that. So what they declined into, and this, I mean, the Roman Empire went through this period, and we're talking about centuries. The French Revolution, when they reset up a new state, went through this in a matter of a decade. That's how compressed and rapid the time was. Within 10 years of the French Revolution, you had a new Caesar, Napoleon. He seized control through a military coup. He gave the mob a whiff of grape shot. He went off on a foreign adventure to whip his army into shape in Egypt. And after everybody was together, he marched on a program of conquest. He wedded the revolutionary liberal ideology to a reality of Roman, army style and so forth. He developed some modern strategic concepts that didn't exist before. But nonetheless, his motivation was that he could keep these troops really well worked up with ideology. He could keep the country bound together. The nation-state constantly pumping in resources. He imposed a whole money system, Napoleon's, around coins and stuff like that. And he marched through Europe conquering and took over. He went essentially, at one point, controlled all of Europe. He went all the way to Russia and plunged himself deep into the Eastern Empire and finally lost himself there. In fact, by the time he got there, or at least for that brief period of time, Europe was three empires. The French, which controlled everything, including Austria and Prussia and so forth. The Russian, which is the old leftover, basically the inheritors of the Byzantines. And the British, who were, of course, busily trying to re-emulate the Roman Empire, as I mentioned earlier. So there you had it, back in the 1801 to 1815 period. That was the shape of the world then. And you had the United States sitting way over there trying to become another Roman Republic. And so all these states kept, as I said, remembered Rome. Well, time moved on, ideology moved on. This didn't seem to happen. A lot of people began to wonder about this liberalism thing. It didn't seem to be working out the way it was supposed to. You know, why wasn't free enterprise and free trade and constitutional governments and limited forms of governments producing a nice, peaceful, you know, progressive society? Even back as early as Adam Smith, this is the inquiry into the wealth of nations, not the poverty or the destruction or the mass murdering of nations. So liberalism itself came into attack, and people tried to patch it up. So there you get a whole series of ideologies in the 1800s. I mentioned some of them, going up to modern times, including Georgism and social credit. But one version was that that there was something inherently avaricious, voracious, whatever, in the concept of liberal economies, of the sort of free market. And I'm putting it in quotes because it was a free market under a state's protection, which is, hopefully you all think of that as a contradiction. But anyway, this was called a liberal economy. And what it really meant, of course, is the state was restraining itself a little so that it could build up more capital. And if the capital was built up, we would remember the capital pyramid from yesterday. There would be, you know, the higher the capital pyramid grew, the more progressive the economy, the more technology would evolve, and so forth. So we got a liberal economy, I guess, versus a conservative economy. Now, conservative economy you were worried about the term, but the conservatives retained that position of more voraciousness because what did they want? Tariffs and mercantilism and import quotas and, you know, big lists of privileges that the king handed out. So you would follow along that train. Okay, so what happened then was a brand new philosophy. There were many of them coming out, but one in particular caught on, and it was supposed to correct the errors of liberalism. It's not obvious today. In fact, it's almost totally counterintuitive today, but it's one of the things I've discovered in my historical readings. I've read it in modern people saying these things, but it was confirmed when I really investigated it. But this is hard to believe, that socialism arose out of this. The socialists did not come out of this side where you would expect them. There's a lot of similarities between modern socialism and old Tory conservatism, but that's not how it evolved. Early socialism came out of liberalism. It was an attempt to correct the problems of the free market society. They wanted a freer society. They wanted to somehow restrain the voraciousness and the warmongering and all the rest of the state. And since everybody seemed to believe in a freer society, a freer market, and you know, all those neat things, democracy was for some reason looked on positively. It seemed like in some way the people of the market were having, you know, the underclass were having some control over these aristocrats, and the new aristocrats, the self-imposed ones. And they also perceived, to some extent correctly, that there was a new aristocracy of wealth growing. Okay, now what are we talking about here before we get off into it? A lot of people who have a free enterprise, you know, semi-libertarian background do not immediately think in these terms. But when the bourgeois, yeah.
We're going to be taking a break soon, so I'll wait, otherwise I'm going to have to step out of it.
Oh, okay. All right, why don't we do it in 5 minutes? How's that?
Great.
Okay. I'll try to set up a cliffhanging thing here,
I
so
don't
I'll
want to
rush
miss
back.
a word.
Yeah, so you can all rush back here and get to the next issue of the serial. Where we are going to leave off is here. As I said, there was a constant growth, but this is something that should be recognized. And regardless of what kind of states came and went and how much they might have set back the economy at any given time from their voraciousness and plunder, there has been a constant growth of economy, a constant progression, overall, averaged, and so forth, up. The empires would cycle on a general upward movement of society itself. The state as a parasite on society itself was a growing part. So what happened is that in these periods when we had the sort of liberal concepts and the rise of the bourgeoisie, the rise of the big businessmen and so forth, small businessmen for that matter, these businessmen were rising in a culture, in a society where they saw, they learned some history too, and they saw these people around, these aristocrats, and they decided they wanted to be like them. So unfortunately, what happened was they didn't have their own, they did have their own culture actually, I shouldn't say that, but they tried to emulate the one that appeared superior to them. So what you had was this tendency for successful, I'll use the term businessmen here since it's more common in the U.S. than bourgeois, but that's in fact, if you were anywhere in Europe, you would call them burghers or bourgeoisie or whatever. There was a constant tendency for them to want to promote themselves to a, and I'll use the term neo because in fact, in some cases they actually became aristocracy. They simply, the old aristocracy being land-based and land no longer being as important, were rapidly losing their wealth and titles, and you know, they sell their titles just so that they could eat for a while and sell their land. So that what happened is that these people would buy that, and they would buy themselves into the state apparatus. And they would get, of course, privileges for themselves. They would support mercantilism. They would become the conservative interests, or originally they were the Whigs, so that transferred over to the conservatives. To some extent, they might become liberals, but the liberalism then itself would take on this sort of neo-aristocratic viewpoint. And because of that, we had a rule, these sort of ultra-radical liberals who said there was some basic problem with all this, saw the growth of a new aristocracy, a new control, a new ruler based on wealth, and the term for that is plutocracy. And this was the enemy, and this is how they perceived him, and they attacked the marketplace itself as the source of this. That it was something inherent in the problem of having a market, and having a free enterprise system and so forth, that the results they wanted, but they didn't want the positive results, but the negative ones they didn't. So they attempted to figure out how to control the situation. How could we take over this government, you know, the state or whatever, the apparatus, which was now justifying itself on an ideological basis. If the government exists to provide us with goodness and light and so forth, and it was making errors, then we ought to take it over, get rid of all the bad part of it, cut off all this corrupt part, and do only good by it. And so you end up with socialism and an attack on plutocracy, and we'll cliffhang at that point. After that, we'll go into, we'll be in the situation to explain why the modern counter-economy arose.